November 2008. This was the night many people in the United States believed that our nation's long history of racial division had come to an end. We were entering what was optimistically called post-racial America. But in the decades since the American people elected the country's first black president, most of our nation's most complex social issues continue to revolve around race. Why is this such a stumbling block for us? What will it take for us to finally come together? Can the issues of race ever truly be overcome? Or is it just human nature to divide ourselves along racial lines?
There are a lot of people who believe that racism is there, it's always going to be there, there's nothing you can do about it, you know, you are the race you are, blah, blah, blah. And I say, no, this is something we made up.
Wait, what?
This is something we made up.
So if we made race up, what's the story? A closer look at history reveals that the story of race is a story of labor. Most of us were taught that North America was initially colonized by those seeking religious freedom. But in fact, most Europeans, including the Pilgrims, came for land and economic opportunity. At that time, there was no concept of race as we know it. No one identified by the color of their skin, but by their country of origin: French, English, Dutch, Spanish. By the early 17th century, the colony's plantation economy was booming. This created a massive need for cheap labor, a need largely filled by poor European immigrants. Some landowners also used enslaved people from African nations, but at the time, an enslaved person's status was not lifelong. One could gain their freedom. However, in 1676, enslaved Africans joined with European indentured servants in a large rebellion against the colonial government in Virginia. Alarmed by the natural alliance between the indentured and enslaved, the ruling class passed a series of laws that segregated and permanently enslaved those of African descent, while also giving their European counterparts new rights and status. This divide and conquer strategy paved the way for what would become an organized system of racial chattel slavery.
And that was how you kept a system in place, and why you had white people who were poor not challenging the system, because they were sold a bill of goods that somehow whiteness was going to include them in all the benefits of society.
The first legal use of the term white appeared in 1691 in a document created by the colonial government of Virginia, used intentionally to differentiate people by the color of their skin rather than their nation of origin. In 1790, Thomas Jefferson put forth the first U.S. national census, which placed the population into the categories of free white males, free white females, and all other free persons. Enslaved black people were counted as well, but only as 3/5 of a person. Native Americans weren't counted at all. And at its first sitting, Congress passed the Naturalization Act, which stated that only free whites could become United States citizens.
You have to be white. That was the first thing they said. The very first thing, you have to be white.
What humans have done is ascribe meaning and difference to skin colors and then use those meanings to create hierarchies. And so when we say race is socially constructed, it's about the ways in which humans have created hierarchies related to racial difference.
The construct of race as a way to assign value to human beings became woven into the structures of this new nation, with white people valued above all others. This ideology has been upheld and reinforced throughout our country's history, continually seeking legitimization through pseudoscience, civil policy, and bad theology, all examined through a white lens.
White supremacy is the idea that not only is it great to be white, but it's better than anybody else. It's better than any other color. It is the best. The way that white folks do things, the way that white folks think, the way that white folks do church, the way that white folks write and talk about God, it's better than anybody else.
As a person of color, I notice this when I walk into denominational headquarters, or I walk into seminaries and Christian colleges, and I look at all the important people of that denomination, and they're old white men. And it's telling me that for the history of this denomination, or for the history of this Christian college or university, they believe that the only important people to put up on the walls are old white men. That implicitly is affirming or asserting white superiority.
Whiteness became a culture in and of itself, to be defended at all cost. In the 19th century, Chinese immigrants became another target of racially biased policies.
And because there was this fear that these Chinese laborers were stealing good white men's jobs, as if those jobs belonged to them, this sentiment kind of emerged and swelled and ultimately led to the Chinese Exclusionary Act, the one and only time we excluded an entire group of people from being able to immigrate into our country just based off their ethnicity. The Exclusionary Act starts as a 10-year act, but it ultimately is extended for 60 years.
European immigrants, such as the Irish, Italians, and Germans, were also initially viewed as a threat and were often persecuted. But they had one distinct advantage. They were light-skinned. So, over time, by stripping away or hiding their ethnic heritage, eventually they could assimilate and become white. The United States has been referred to as the melting pot, a metaphor for the fusion of nationalities, cultures, and ethnicities.
I've never really liked the term melting pot because it just means that it's going to become one thing. And so who decides what the one thing is? When you're the minority, that means that everything of yours is lost.
It seems the metaphor of the melting pot, in truth, is a push for white homogeny rather than an embrace of diversity.
My own children are way lighter skinned than I am. And what's happened, I think, even with my children, is that our celebrations and our language are slowly dissipating and disappearing. And I wonder what my grandchildren will be like. They'll be, and I keep thinking they'll be the next white generation.
Today, the concept of race and the structures that hold up whiteness as the norm have become so embedded in our culture that it's extraordinarily difficult for most white people to see the ways they influence life in this country.
Because being white is what's normal, and it's normal for everybody.
It's just what it means to be human. We don't think of it in racial terms.
And so my question's always been like, what is white culture? Let's talk about that. And that's hard to define because really what there might be alluding to is white supremacy.
We don't see the advantages, and we usually only recognize it when we are with persons of color and they get treated differently than us. What we think is as normal is really an advantage.
And the advantages are often stark. A 2016 national study of household wealth found that the median net worth of white families was 8 times higher than that of Hispanic families and 10 times higher than that of Black families. Another 2016 study revealed that Black, Hispanic, and Native American children are more than twice as likely as white children to be living in low-income homes.
When we focus on what makes us, quote, the same, it denies the fact that our lives are not the same. And we live in different worlds with different realities. And so when we focus on the things that make us the same and we can't agree on humanity.
I think what we have done with race is evil. I mean, I'm of the belief that difference is not evil.
You and I did not start this system of race and white supremacy. But if we do not actively work at uncovering our own inherent bias and tearing down the system, we are guilty still of supporting it.
We need to recognize that we do live in a society that is oppressive to people of color and has a long history of white supremacy.
This has always been who America is. The dissolution of the American exceptionalism dream. We're realizing sort of in our collective consciousness that we're no better than any empire that's ever come before.
We've been taught that the United States was founded on religious liberty, which means the history of the American church is tightly bound to the history of American culture, including colonialism, racism, and white supremacy. But how is it possible that a religion founded in the boundless love and compassion of Christ could ever align itself with the ideologies that have only brought harm? It's all in the interpretation.
There is no concept of race in the Bible, because race is a thoroughly modern construction. There are, though, a lot of things that look like race in the Bible.
In the Old Testament, a great deal of focus is placed upon a concept of people, translated from the Hebrew word am. People, in this instance, are God's chosen people, the Israelites. Those who are not a part of Israel are referred to as the nations. The nations shared a common ancestry with Israel, but worshiped different gods.
It does not involve facial features, skin tone, things that are physical characteristics.
In the New Testament, we find a similar divide between Jewish people and non-Jewish people, who are called Gentiles.
And so, while there are components of national identity, components of cultural identity, they're all subsumed under this question of what's your religious identity?
The white church in the U.S. would often interpret these passages about ancient religious divides as parallels to the racial divides that were deemed essential to the success of the American experiment.
In American theology, that divide then gets applied white versus other. Israel equals white Americans, the nations equals the others.
In the book of Joshua, we see the Israelites invading and eradicating many nations: the Hittites, the Girgashites, the Amorites, the Canaanites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, and the Jebusites, all in order to claim the land God had promised them. In the age of colonization and westward expansion, North America became the promised land. The Pilgrims, the Puritans, and the pioneers became God's chosen people. And the nations they were subduing were the many indigenous tribes: the Seminoles, the Algonquin, the Cherokee, the Choctaw, the Iroquois, the Chickasaw, and many, many more. In the case of slavery, we can trace the progression of this race-based theology through colonial law. In 1656, an enslaved woman of African descent named Elizabeth Key won her and her infant son's freedom in court, partly on the grounds that she was a baptized Christian. At that time, it was English law that a baptized Christian could not be enslaved. Shortly after Key was freed, a new colonial law was passed that eliminated this loophole, clearly stating that baptism did not equate freedom from the bonds of slavery.
If you already think that slavery is an institution that needs to continue for your economic survival, you go to Ephesians and you say, Paul says, slaves obey your masters. And the problem with this is it's an incredibly decontextualized reading.
It was the Christian church that baptized Africans as they left the shores of Africa into slavery and gave them Christian names or English names to replace their African names.
The ability to be a Christian and still be a slave owner, which I think most of us today would say is completely contrary to the scripture that we read. That foundation was built by white theologians who, in a sense, manipulated the text.
Even as slave owners used the Bible to justify and sanctify the ownership and oppression of other human beings, the enslaved Africans embraced biblical narratives of justice and freedom, finding hope in the story of God's promise to deliver an oppressed people.
And so we see enslaved Africans taking Old Testament stories of Israelites and using that to connect with, right? To understand that there were enslaved people in the Bible and God freed them. We also see enslaved people contesting the ways in which masters use the Bible to subject them and saying this is morally wrong and morally corrupt.
The Bible has long helped fuel Black people's fight against injustice in the United States. From the abolition of slavery to securing the right to vote, to ending Jim Crow laws, and on into today.
When I think about the story of Jesus and connecting it to enslavement, to the history of African Americans, it's always being on the side of those who are most marginalized and trying to transform society to respond to those people.
So you look at the Bible and you read the first century church and how the church was formed. It was formed in Jewish communities, and Jews in the first century were an oppressed ethnic and religious minority. So the church, though, that came to the United States came from Europe, and it was a church built on colonialism, and white supremacy was interwoven. And so what we received was a European form of Christianity that was very different than what you read about in the pages of the Bible.
Even as our theological frameworks have expanded to reflect the experiences and theologies of Christians around the world, the bedrock of white supremacy still shows through our language.
When we talk about Western theology, we don't say this is actually Swiss theology or German theology or specifically American theology. We just say it's theology. We centralize Western theology by just calling it theology, and all the others are on the periphery: Black theology, womanist theology, liberation theology. And we've created an otherness because we're saying you're not the norm.
My entire experience in seminary, we're going to assimilate you, we're going to teach you good theology, we're going to teach you the way that we do it, and then we're going to send you out there, right?
It's the way we think about how we're going to bring our good American or Western progressive theology to a world that doesn't know any better. To say we're going to go to Africa and fix their theology for them. We're going to go to Asia and fix their theology for them. I think that assumption of the superiority of one culture or one people group over against the other is much more common than we realize.
If you're not willing to submit to the leadership of a local leader, an indigenous leader, a leader of color, then you're not actually coming in to do ministry. You're actually going to be manifesting colonization.
Just the way that I saw missions being worked in our communities of color here in Chicago as well, seeing how white churches that had money would come in, the thought that there wasn't Jesus here until they came, that they were bringing Jesus into our city. And I'm like, Jesus is already in the city. Jesus is already working through plenty of us that are doing this work.
The Eurocentric roots of the American church have created structures that focus on the experiences and perspectives of white people, a focus that creates all kinds of unseen biases.
I'll be honest, I know I have plenty of bias. I have plenty of things that I assume about other people. And so I think it's not a question of not having assumptions. I think it's a question of what do you do with them? And are you aware of them?
I think the most important thing that we can do is to get out of the way, in the sense that there are people in the United States and people around the world, in immigrant communities, in global Christianity, who are reading the Bible very differently than we are.
And by having folks speaking for their own communities, speaking of how they interpret the scripture, we now have a counter narrative that can be put in conversation with our traditional narrative.
The diversity of voices around the world serve to remind us that the Word of God carries a core message of inclusion, and that God cannot be limited to one cultural expression. There is a popular story of race in the United States that goes something like this.
The United States of America is the land of opportunity, a melting pot where people from all over the world come to live in freedom, to escape repression, to share in the American dream.
This is a familiar story, one we've all heard many times. It is the story of American exceptionalism. This story is about a noble war to end slavery in the United States and extending the right to vote to formerly enslaved peoples, of banding together to win a world war twice. A story of civil rights earned, equality before the law, and equality at the ballot box. This is a story of progress. In this story, there is no organized effort to harm Black people by white people.
The truth is, there's no organized effort to harm Black people by white people. That doesn't exist here.
See? There is, however, a counter-narrative of our nation's history.
There are these huge gaping holes in what we call U.S. history because it's not told from the perspective of people of color, because it's not written or institutionally affirmed by people of color.
Filling in the gaping holes of U.S. history paints a very different picture of what it means to celebrate the United States. This story includes the beginning of the transatlantic slave trade and the growth of slavery across the English colonies. This story recognizes the resistance to evil among those who were enslaved and the commitment to slavery among white people. This story is characterized by the violence against Black and brown bodies and born out of white supremacist theology, racist laws, and cultural oppression. One that celebrates Black achievement in the face of such oppression and confronts violence always. White Americans have never needed to tell this other story. The narrative of white supremacy makes it possible to see only the story of progress.
I think white folks don't need to imagine it, or thought they didn't. If you're not thinking about Black folks 24/7, and by Black I mean people of color. You can spare yourself. You can read books, you can watch TV shows, but at the end of the day, you can go back to being white and be spared.
When I served in rural Ohio, we were the only Black family in the town that we lived in. And it was about as challenging as you can imagine. I just had another baby. That was our youngest. So I'm at home and getting ready to nurse. And Benny wants to go for a walk. My husband goes for a walk, takes the two other kids in the double stroller. And as he's going for a walk, he comes right back. I mean, just a matter of 2 minutes, he's right back home. And I said, what happened? And he said, this parishioner, he said, he just tried to kill us. I said, what are you talking about? You know, I'm thinking he's exaggerating. He said he tried to run us over. He drove up onto the curve and he said, it was right after President Obama was reelected. He said, that fucking nigger president is trying to ruin my country and I'm gonna run you fucking niggers out of this town. And proceeded to drive up onto the curve to kill my husband and our two small children.
The American mistake is believing that we are exceptional and different. This is a country that's built on the genocide of indigenous people, that an entire economy is built on the black backs of people who've never been given reparations, and has continued to reinforce those racist structures and systems for its own benefit. And that fault line runs through the entire American experience. This has always been who America is.
It's easy to think that the story of violence against Black bodies belongs to the country's past. But white supremacy is still on the march. Enabled by the lack of understanding of how society reinforces racial prejudice across legal, educational, professional, and social metrics, racist systems are failing Black Americans. One example is home ownership, the centerpiece of the American dream.
What we understand and what historically we can see with African Americans is that the way that you become a citizen is through ownership. Because what happens when you own a home? You have say not only of your own domicile, but then you get to be a part of a community, right, that can take political action.
The benefits of home ownership in the U.S. are enormous, from tax breaks and credit benefits to building equity and passing it to our descendants. These benefits have been systematically denied to a majority of Black Americans. In the 1930s, as part of the New Deal, loan programs were created to help Americans purchase homes. In order to determine who received a loan, the government created color-coded maps where green neighborhoods indicated low risk and red neighborhoods were high risk. This practice, now known as redlining, heavily favored white communities.
Home ownership for African Americans has been racially contested because of the ways in which the federal government colluded with mortgage companies to redline and to blockbust African American neighborhoods. Neighborhoods that were predominantly African American were automatically deemed high risk, which meant they were less likely to get loans to purchase, right?
Right after World War II, we had this huge endowment or investment in the suburbs that came from the Federal Housing Authority. Of the $120 billion that was invested in suburban housing, less than 2% of that went to non-white families.
This is Levittown, Pennsylvania, a new suburban community of 60,000 people midway between Philadelphia and Trenton, New Jersey. With its giant shopping center, winding lanes named for flowers and trees, it is fairly typical of communities all over America, where families are pursuing the American dream to give their children a better chance in life. Why did you select Levittown to live?
We were looking for a place to buy a home. We looked at Levittown, and we liked the homes here. We liked the advantages that Levittown seemed to offer in comparison to other cities. And we understood that it was going to be all white, and we were very happy to buy a home here.
In the 19th century, the U.S. government claimed that people of African descent were property. In the 20th century, the same government worked to ensure Black Americans couldn't own property. Predatory and biased lending practices have been exposed over and over in the United States, revealing a continuing systemic effort to withhold economic benefits from Black families that are readily available to white families. So what is a white homeowner to do? Give up their home?
We're not asking you to sell your home. We're not asking you to even move, but we're asking you to think about the structures that we all implicitly buy into that create and replicate inequality, and how we can think about dismantling those.
The answer to the problem is eventually when you find that there are no more areas to which a white person can move without having a Negro family in. Well, that would be the best end that there could be to segregation, and it is probably something that will happen in the future, perhaps in the near future.
When Christopher Columbus arrived on the shores of a new world in 1492, he brought with him a belief in his God-given right to take over any lands he found in the name of Spain and Christianity. This right was given to Columbus and all European explorers by various papal edicts that would come to be known as the Doctrine of Discovery. It's hard to overstate the impact the Doctrine of Discovery has had on the world in the last 500 years.
So the Doctrine of Discovery is basically an agreement between the European nations in the 15th century. Whoever discovers it first and lays claim to the land, they own that. If Portugal goes out and discovers some land in Western Africa, and 15 years later, France goes out and discovers the same land, who does this land belong to?
With the Doctrine of Discovery, such questions are easily dispensed of.
It essentially starts out as this peace agreement between European nations, but really what it becomes is the theological authority to enslave non-Christian people and also just to strip their land of all the resources. Any movable or immovable good now belongs to the crown.
The earliest edict of this kind was the Doom de Versailles, issued by Pope Nicholas V in 1452, which gave colonizing Europeans permission directly from God to, quote, capture, vanquish, and subdue the enemies of Christ, to put them into perpetual slavery, and to take all their possessions and property.
That papal bull is kind of the birth of white Christian relationship to Native people, to indigenous people. One of the things it did was it allowed people, white people or non-Native people, non-indigenous people, to put themselves on a higher level of their relationship with God.
40 years and numerous additional edicts reinforcing these beliefs would pass before Columbus set foot in the New World.
By the time Columbus arrives in the Western Hemisphere in 1492, the thought that these people he's encountering are made in the image of God doesn't even enter into his consciousness at that point, because for 40 years now, the church and these European nations have been operating under the understanding that these are not people. It's like any other resource. You can do what you will with it. And we as natives kind of point to this as the foundation for all of the atrocities that takes place with so-called discovery and imperialism, because we were not seen as human. We were seen as barbarians. We were resources to either be enslaved and utilized or removed entirely.
The Doctrine of Discovery was both a political and religious document, sanctioning centuries of slavery, genocide, and other atrocities worldwide. Even now, its tenets remain embedded in modern society.
The very fact that I have a piece of paper that says that I own this house and the lot that it's on, my right to own that is rooted in the Doctrine of Discovery.
In the 19th century, a series of Supreme Court cases updated the Doctrine of Discovery from the age of exploration to the time of westward expansion. In the 1823 case of Johnson versus McIntosh, the court ruled unanimously that natives did not own the land that they occupied, as it belonged to the European nation that discovered it. That ruling provided the groundwork for westward colonial expansion via the land rush, the pioneer spirit, and the belief in manifest destiny. Manifest destiny being the belief that white settlers had a right, imbued by God, to claim all the lands of the continent, from the Atlantic to the Pacific.
This land is mine! Mine by destiny!
The value for Native people has always been our land. That's what they wanted. They always wanted our land.
The hunger for land required policies for the removal or eradication of Native communities. These included forced relocation to reservations, forced conversion to Christianity, outlawing Native spiritual practice, and child removal to boarding schools.
Well, I guess I can start out with my own story. I was sent to a boarding school when I was a child, and it was called St. Mary's School for Indian Girls, and it was run by the church. And when we got to the school, we were isolated or separated from our families. We went to school, of course, we took our classes, but before we did that, we worked. We were the maintenance crew for the school. So we took care of the grounds, we took care of the buildings, we did all of the work. That is the Doctrine of Discovery on the church side, because they took our family away, they took our identity away. We really became non-children.
The boarding school system aspired to nothing less than the total annihilation of Native identity. As Brigadier General Richard Henry Pratt, founder of Carlisle Indian Industrial School, wrote, "Kill the Indian, save the man."
Quite literally, boarding schools are where Indians went to die.
You don't know who you are anymore because your family traditions are gone. Your cultural traditions are gone. Your pride is gone. You aren't Indian or Native American anymore, and you're not white.
The voice that screams from the shadows of these boarding schools is that these were horrible places. These were places of trauma, abuse, of death.
The goal of eradicating Native identity has allowed white people to ignore the very existence of modern Native people.
people don't bring Native Americans into their collective imagination and collective consciousness into the 20th century, and certainly not into the 21st century.
People say, well, you say you're Indian, but you don't look Indian.
What does it mean to look Indian? For many, it means a romanticized pop culture cliche.
A noble chief on horseback wearing a headdress, or an Indian maiden at the side of a babbling brook doing her daily tasks.
The failure to imagine contemporary Native people has left American culture dangerously uninformed.
Now listen up. These are our seats now, and there ain't a damn thing you can do about it. So why don't you and Super Engine there find yourself someplace else to have a powwow, okay?
I would say it probably happens twice a year where someone will say, I seriously thought that the Native people had all died out, that there were no Native people anymore.
The erasure of Native identity in America and in Christianity has left all of us looking at an incomplete image of the world. When we ignore cultures, erase authentic identities, we ignore part of God's creation.
What is missing when you completely other Native people and you shut them out and you don't allow the wisdoms from their ceremonial practices and their spirituality, you don't even give it audience, you don't even give it a good face-to-face. You're missing so much. You're missing rootedness, you're missing connection.
By some accounts, the Women's March in January of 2017 was the biggest single-day protest in the history of the United States. In response to the election of President Donald Trump, an estimated 4.5 million people marched in the streets across the nation. But not everyone felt welcome at the marches that day. Many women of color, in particular, felt excluded from the organizing efforts and unwelcome at the event.
The critique was of the Women's March was that it only represented a narrow portion of women.
The event's original name, the Million Women March, was the same as the historic march in 1997, organized by Black women to protest the feminist movement's history of ignoring women of color.
There was this focus on what the general understanding of women's rights and equality would be, and for some, that's what white women's interests are.
Because some considered the Women's March to be primarily an expression of white interests, it places the event in a long history of tension between the efforts for women's equality and advancing rights for people of color. A tension perhaps best illustrated in the person of Susan B. Anthony. Anthony was a Quaker, born in 1820 in Massachusetts. She spent her life tirelessly fighting for women's rights, particularly the right to vote. A founding member of the American Equal Rights Association and the National Women's Suffrage Association, Susan B. Anthony is perhaps the most well-known figure from the women's suffrage movement. She is a towering figure in the fight for women's equality in the United States. More specifically, equality for white women. Susan B. Anthony's legacy in the feminist movement stands, and should, but it should not be divorced from her legacy on race. Anthony was close friends with abolitionist Frederick Douglass and active in the anti-slavery movement. But upon the passage of the 14th Amendment, which gave voting rights to Black men and not white women, she responded thus.
We say if you will not give the whole loaf of suffrage to the entire people, give it to the most intelligent first. If intelligence, justice, and morality are to have precedence in the government, let the question of the woman be brought up first, and that of the Negro last.
Words like these established the women's equality movement in the United States as one primarily motivated by white women seeking power comparable to white men, interests that alienated women of color from the feminist movement for over a century.
I never thought of myself as a feminist because the way it was portrayed in the world is it felt like a very white movement, you know, burn the bra. No one's going to burn their bra. That bra costs $10.99 or whatever. So it was always this kind of, where do I belong in this movement? Am I a part of this movement at all?
Excluded from the women's movement due to racism, women of color also faced oppression from men in the civil rights movement. Consider the story of Ella Baker.
I am here to represent the struggle that has gone on for 300 or more years. A struggle to be recognized as citizens in a country in which we were born.
I would call her a leader. She probably wouldn't call herself that because she was a person who liked to be behind the scenes.
Throughout her work, Baker argued for truly shared power among a network of leaders, rather than relying on charismatic individuals. This opinion was not popular with many of the prominent men in the movement.
And what she noticed among the Black ministers there was their extreme sexism. And she was not afraid to call that out. And so Ella Baker had these difficult relationships, particularly with folks like Dr. King and with Black ministers, because they did not want to see Black women in positions of leadership and power because of the gender dynamics at the time.
Baker is remembered as a crucial organizer and voice for Black women in the civil rights movement. Someone who stood up to sexism when she saw it. And she was not alone.
Ella Baker's life becomes kind of a mirror through which we can see the lives of other women. The fact that we have many Black women working behind the scenes, doing all types of work for the movement, and yet we know very little about them. And Ella Baker really caused us to redefine and rethink leadership and the democratic potential of civil rights.
There is a word for the combined experience of oppression that women of color have faced in the United States. It's a word that has become very popular in recent years, but is often misunderstood.
Intersectionality.
Intersectionality. The word intersectionality was coined by civil rights activist and professor Kimberlé Crenshaw in 1989, calling attention to the reality that an individual can experience compounding oppression from multiple directions for different aspects of their identity.
Usually, we think of race, class, gender, sexuality, etc. What parts of a person's identity kind of come together to create their specific form of oppression?
Attention to intersecting identities began to emerge in the 1970s, with groups like the Combahee River Collective, which formed to address the needs of not only Black feminists, but also Black lesbians. One member of the Combahee River Collective, poet and activist Audre Lorde, succinctly captured the importance of intersectional feminism.
I simply do not believe that one aspect of myself can possibly profit from the oppression of any other part of my identity. Within the lesbian community, I am Black. And within the Black community, I am a lesbian. I cannot afford the luxury of fighting one form of oppression only.
The influence of women like Ella Baker, the Combahee River Collective, and Kimberlé Crenshaw is evident in the more recent creation of a powerful contemporary political movement, Black Lives Matter. Black Lives Matter was created by Alicia Garza, Opal Tometi, and Patrisse Cullors after George Zimmerman was acquitted for the murder of 17-year-old Trayvon Martin. In the past 10 years, Black Lives Matter has grown into an international organization comprised of dozens of chapters fighting on behalf of racial profiling, police abuse, transgender rights, and many other injustices.
I really like the organizational structure of Black Lives Matter in the sense that it's decentralized, that the way they think about leadership is different. Instead of having one particular charismatic leader, they don't have that. What they call their movement a leader-full movement. I think the fact that, not only is it 3 women, but 3 queer women starting Black Lives Matter, I think that's really important for thinking about the ways in which we can be more intersectional in our approach to justice.
In the late 1700s, Richard Allen, a formerly enslaved devout Methodist and lay minister, accepted an invitation to preach at St. George's Church in Philadelphia. Allen's preaching was very popular, causing a rapid growth of Black membership. Soon the church had outgrown its seating capacity. But when Allen requested the church create a second congregation for Black people, the white elders refused. Instead, they built a balcony to segregate Black members from white members. In 1792, a fellow lay minister, Absalom Jones, challenged this division by sitting downstairs. He was then physically removed during the opening prayer. In response, Richard Allen led the entire Black membership out of the building. Later, Allen said of the incident, "We all went out of the church in a body, and they were no longer plagued by us." Allen and Jones each went on to lead their own Black congregations. Reverend Allen would eventually form a new denomination, the African Methodist Episcopal Church, the first independent denomination founded by Black people in the U.S. Even after the Civil War and the end of slavery, the divide between the white church and the Black church remained wide and kept getting wider. In the early 20th century, facing rampant inequality, voter suppression, persecution, and violence, droves of Black families moved out of the rural southern United States into urban areas of the Northeast, Midwest, and West in what is called the Great Migration.
Millions of Black people left and sometimes had to escape from the South because of the horrid conditions there, and they came north for better opportunity, for better jobs, for better education. It changed the landscape of America.
In 1890, around 90% of Black people in the U.S. lived in southern states. Over the next 80 years, nearly 50% would leave the South in an exodus of over 6 million people. The growth of Black populations in historically white communities led to another kind of migration.
What we know that happened during the Great Migration is this mass group of African Americans moving into these urban places creates housing problems. And so instead of many cities firmly addressing these housing problems, what typically happens is overcrowding. In conjunction with overcrowding, what happens is that white folks also are leaving neighborhoods.
And that's when you see the growth of the megachurches in the suburbs, because a lot of the churches in the cities were being abandoned by white Protestants, moved to the suburbs, and created kind of these communities in the suburbs that are white, middle, upper middle class communities, as well as white, middle, upper middle class churches. And many of the urban centers became places where ethnic minority churches were started.
Despite the progress of the civil rights movement, school desegregation, and policies like affirmative action, Christian communities have remained highly segregated. As of 2014, nearly 80% of Christians attend churches where they are among the overwhelming racial majority. Unlike most large U.S. institutions, the church is not required by law to integrate. Congregations are made of individuals who intentionally choose to come together, which means a majority of Christians are choosing segregation, making church possibly the most telling measure of where race relations in the United States actually stands. Even well-meaning white congregations who might want to reflect the full diversity of the U.S. population struggle with the reality that their theology and practices are immersed in white cultural norms that alienate people of color.
Our liturgy is constructed a certain way that feeds and fills white Christians. The way that we choreograph our movement around the sanctuary is also very white and very European. The way that we talk, how we keep things under 12 minutes in our sermons, how we sing 3 verses of a hymn, how the hymns always have to be played from the organ or from the piano. Those are constructs that make perfect sense in our mind as being worshipful, but at the same time are excluding.
Why are we singing songs by Germans? Why don't they include any songs from authors and composers that are not white? Who decides that this is the way that we should worship, and this is the way that we should do things.
I remember sitting there when the service was over and thinking, I came in, I sat down, I was prayed over, I was sang to, I was preached at, and I was dismissed. For me, there was no spiritual component to the worship service. And I thought it was very sterile.
Black churches, on the other hand, often focus on Christ as a source of hope and rescue in the face of ongoing oppression. A theology shaped by the history and experience of Black lives in America.
When I have to be able to rise above the pain of the cuts that I receive on a daily basis, when I just need to let go and let God, connecting with people on a much deeper level because of the pain that we have experienced together. It's different than what I could imagine a life where I have everything that I need. I'm not suffering at all. It's just different. It's a different place.
Can Black and white Christianity find common ground? Can the chasm between us, created by racism and white supremacy, be overcome?
There's not enough diversity in our congregations, in our denomination, because we refuse to make space for that diversity.
And so when they talk about racial reconciliation, they don't really want their congregation body to change. They don't really want 50-50 white and people of color. Maybe one or two. Because I think people are comfortable where they're at.
When congregations become multiracial, you will often see a group of white people leave the church. And it's either a fear of change, a fear of doing things differently, fear of losing power.
Richard Allen and Absalom Jones left St. George's Church because it was not in fact their church, but a white church they were being allowed to attend. The persistent segregation of churches today raises the question, how much has really changed?
Baptize me, John.
I think it's very hard for us to grasp the depths of the racism inherent inside of our own church. 10 years ago when I was here, if you were to walk into the sanctuary, front and center at the top of the chancel would be this gorgeous painting of a Norwegian Jesus. And it was beautiful and it was inspiring, but anytime anyone who didn't look Norwegian looked at that painting, they never came back. And we all scratched our heads wondering why.
I see a white Jesus, that's telling me that whiteness is good, whiteness is holiness, and that even the creator, the savior of the world who came down to love us in physical form is white.
Everything about kind of the history of Christianity from Europe to the US has been built around whiteness. It's just in the DNA of the US church. The church feels very white.
The phrase white Christianity, the phrase, it's an idolatry. Think about it. White Christianity is an idolatry. And what do idols do in the Bible? Idols separate us from God.
How can a church immersed in white supremacy even begin to reconcile its ongoing legacy of exclusion, oppression, and violence? Is it even possible?
Reconciliation, take things that are out of balance and bring them back into balance. But the assumption is that there was a balance to begin with.
Reconciliation implies a prior healthy relationship, which we don't have in the United States. So you can really only speak of reconciliation in theological terms.
There is a white Protestant obsession with reconciliation. Yeah, like, stop. Stop. It's the scariest thing I've ever seen. When do we get to the reconciliation? When do I get to feel good? I don't know. I haven't felt good for 400 years historically in this country. I don't know when you get to feel good about this.
Some Christians have looked to foster unity by embracing the ideology of colorblindness, that we should look past skin color and view everyone as the same. But this is problematic at best.
Colorblindness at a sort of very simplistic level seems like what we should all embrace. The reality is, if I don't see someone's color who's not white, then I don't see the fact that they experience racism.
So I don't see color. That's not reconciliation. That's denial.
But to say we don't see skin color automatically makes me shake, because I'm like, am I invisible?
It basically means I see you as white. I see you like me. I've made you kind of into my own image. And it strips away all difference of culture.
And so people take up their experience and then just lay it over top of me.
Whiteness is going to create whiteness. And white supremacy, once it's embedded in the culture and in the culture of a church, it doesn't give you the tools to dismantle itself.
Try as the church might, we cannot whitewash this issue. White supremacy must be addressed directly, with all the hard truths exposed. Acknowledging our history and breaking down the systems that have upheld whiteness as the norm will be messy. It will be controversial. And above all, it will be painful.
When we talk about racial injustice, when we talk about brokenness in our society, when we talk about churches that are hurting, maybe some of us need to realize it's a funeral service and not a hospital visit. We can't go into the room and say, hey, we're going to just sing Kumbaya and join hands and say, I love you, man, and things are going to be okay. We've got to deal with the dead body that is in the room. Because to be blunt, most of the dead bodies in American history are black and brown and red bodies. And if we ignore the dead bodies and we don't lament over the dead bodies, we're just kind of playing the games of faith here. We're just pretending that things are okay when they're really not.
In the Book of Lamentations, the Israelites, after turning away from God, were exiled into Babylon. They had lost everything. Yet God does not offer them hope of deliverance from their plight.
God doesn't call them to reclaim their strength and to go back and make Jerusalem great again. Right? That's not the call. The call is enter into a space of lament.
Make a joyful noise unto the Lord, all ye lands. Come before his presence, come before his presence with singing.
But in the case of modern white Christianity, there seems to be an aversion to lamentation.
The church in America is lousy at engaging suffering and pain and lament. And most churches, when they get to a lament psalm, a psalm that talks about suffering, or a lament hymn in their liturgical reading or in their liturgical worship, they skip it. They drop it. We're talking about a pretty profound act of disobedience to God, to skip over the parts of the scriptures that make us uncomfortable.
Reality is there is no resurrection without crucifixion. And we're going to have to go to those painful places. We're going to have to acknowledge the things within us that have to die so that Christ can rise and live in and through us.
In exposing issues, it gets really bad because you're exposing this wound. And the first thing is recognizing that we have a wound. And I think we're in that kind of messiness right now of saying we have a problem.
We have to let go of what we think is right. We have to let go of what we believe we know. We have to let go of the structures that we thought were the right way to worship God.
God calls us to stand together as a diverse body, to humbly and courageously name and renounce the root causes that divide us, confronting white supremacy at every turn. This is the lifelong commitment of racial justice and equity in our churches, our communities, and the world.
This stuff is not happening in a vacuum. The last 4 or 5 years is not some anomaly in human history. And there have been people who've been walking this path for a long time, and you need to find them, you need to listen to them, and you need to ask, what can I do? And sometimes what can I do is just shut up.